Power. The way that power is exercised really speaks volumes about us as a society and the way that we behave. And there's all sorts of ways that power manifests itself that we're all very familiar with. Westminster, what goes on in the mass media, big corporations, and that's big power. It's very obvious, it's very flashy, it's very loud. But what particularly interests me about the manifestations of power is a lot more subtle. It's about the things that go on every day on a local level, the sorts of things that have quite a big impact on our lives, but aren't necessarily quite as obvious or as loud as what goes on in Westminster. And I'm thinking about things like the way that officials in the town hall might conduct themselves that might make it difficult for people to gain access to services, the way that staff in hospitals or care homes might behave towards people who are staying there, for example, positioning a very elderly infirm person next to an overheated radiator for hours upon end. And also, and in particular, the way it is that we treat the people in our society who are not fashionable, not particularly popular, perhaps on the fringes of society, in particular people like prisoners and detainees. Now, it's really important that as citizens we know how to hold a mirror to power, that we can identify where the power that's exerted all around us by the officials and the people that we encounter might not be being used in the right way, and that we're able and confident to speak out about that when it does happen. Now, one particular example of how I've been involved in monitoring that myself for the last decade or so is in the monitoring of immigration detention. Now, whether you realise this or not, there's a couple of acts of parliament that say whenever somebody is held in prison or in immigration detention, because that is quite a significant incursion into a person's natural civil liberties, there needs to exist what's called an independent monitoring board. And an independent monitoring board is basically a collection of volunteers, so completely separate from authority, not paid, who have the responsibility for going into these establishments, getting a set of keys, wandering around, talking to anybody they want to in the establishments, and looking through the lens of an ordinary person at how people are being treated. What's the food like? What are the interactions like? Are the education facilities okay? If people have problems or they self-harm, are they being dealt with in an appropriate way? And it's really important that people like that people like me, are not experts, that we're not paid, that we're simply ordinary people going in and looking at things and thinking, is this fair? Is this reasonable? Is this decent? We also have the authority to actually talk to the authorities about the way that they're behaving or the way that they're conducting themselves towards people. If we're not happy about something, or if we think that something is particularly good, we're able to bring it to their attention, to ask for justifications. And if we're really not satisfied about the way that things are going, we're able to take that to government ministers or represent it to the public. Now, this is something that I feel particularly passionate about because of immigration detention. People who are held in immigration detention, in contrast to people who are in prison, are not actually there as a result of committing a criminal offence. They're there as a result of an administrative decision, not something that's been decided by a judge. So potentially it can be somebody quite low down in the pecking order within the field of immigration who decides whether or not somebody is deprived of their liberty. Now, forget everything that you know or that you've been told about the rights or wrongs of migration and immigration and benefits and all the rest of it. What we're concerned with here is about the fairness of processes and the way that people are treated when they're actually held in environments like these. One of the really scary things about immigration detention, which is an example of how power is perhaps manifested, wielded over people in this country, is that in the UK, immigration detention can be indefinite. So if I, for example, were to murder somebody, sorry, I don't mean to single you out. If I were to murder somebody and I were convicted of that offence and sent to prison, the chances are, if I was going to be released, I would have a rough idea of how long I would be in an establishment for. But if I were held in immigration detention, potentially I could be there forever. So it's really important that people like me, ordinary people, volunteers, are able to go into these establishments and see how people are being treated and raise concerns when we have them. And in recent years, something else that I've become involved with is the monitoring of the deportation process. In fact, technically what we monitor is really called the enforced removal process. A deportation is if somebody has committed a criminal offence and then they're removed from the UK. And what we look at with this monitoring of the deportation process, if I call it that, is basically when the government decides that it has a certain number of immigration detainees who maybe need to be taken to a single country like Pakistan or Afghanistan or Ghana or Nigeria. And the government will charter an aircraft which will be entirely filled with detainees and escorting officers who will then basically take this group of people back to whichever country they should be going to. And every once in a while, volunteers such as I will actually accompany this process from start to finish. And again, it's a voluntary thing. I'm not an expert. I'm just an ordinary person thinking, is this right? Is there anything here that I should be challenging from the perspective of someone who's not part of the mechanics of government? And basically the way that it works is that I will go to an immigration removal centre where a load of detainees are actually starting on this process. And I will watch as they're brought one by one with all their property and sometimes with confusion and lots of questions and emotions and are searched by escorts and are then taken onto coaches. And I'll accompany them on the coach going to the airport as well. And I'll watch exactly how it is that the escorting officers are treating people, how they're talking to them, whether they're giving them the information that they need, whether it's respectful, whether it's decent. And then it goes on a stage, waiting at the airport and waiting and waiting and waiting and watching what happens when people are actually taken onto the aircraft. This is not a process that anybody actually wants to be involved with. It's not a pleasant experience for anybody. But what the role of the volunteer is, the ordinary person, is to think this process is happening and it's not actually our job or our role to question it, but what we need to do is to see that this process, whilst it's being carried out, is done in the fairest possible way. And there's some pretty horrible things that happen. There's plenty of people who actually want to go back to the country, but there's plenty of people who don't. And sometimes we see really distressing, really upset people. People who will sometimes get so desperate that they will swallow and then regurgitate bits of razor blades in order to be able to self-harm. Sometimes people will have to be physically taken onto the aircraft, carried, restrained. And one of the things that I have to do is stand wherever I can, taking notes and watching how physical restraint might happen. And I've learned quite a lot of things. One thing that I've learned is that, and if I could take it upon myself to maybe criticise the United States of America, heaven forbid, one of the things that I've learned is that in contrast to perhaps the authorities in the United States, which very much make use of the sort of physical apparatus of constraint, one thing that the UK authorities are actually quite good at, and that I've observed a lot, is using as little use of force as possible, using words to de-escalate problems, to try and bring people round. And that's the sort of thing that I'll be looking for. And then we carry on, we accompany the aircraft, we accompany the flight to wherever it might be going, be it Afghanistan or Pakistan or whatever, moving around the aircraft, watching how things are going, seeing how people are being treated, standing in whatever space I can find to watch and take notes on anything that's happening. Now that is a slightly unusual example, but nevertheless a really important one, of how ordinary people can, in the right circumstances, hold the exercise of power to account. Now, the principle is that as an ordinary person, I should know wrong when I see it, and I should be able to challenge that, and I should have the right to take it, if necessary, to the highest authority and say, this is right or this is wrong, justify this. Now, there's plenty of other examples of where people might perform a similar role, and the organisation I represent recently did some work with an organisation in Jamaica called CAFE, which stands for Citizens Action for Free and Fair Elections. Now, CAFE, again, they're a voluntary organisation. They're representatives of the community, and their role is, whenever an election happens, to provide volunteers to go to every polling station, every place where people are voting, and to watch the process for its fairness. Because it's all very well everybody in the country being granted a right to vote, but if that right is blocked in some way, for example, by a polling station being inaccessible, by people being intimidated, by information not being good enough, then that right might just as well not exist. Now, it's possible to forget from time to time that politics actually exists in other countries, what with everything that's going on with the EU referendum and all the rest of it at the moment. But Jamaica actually had a general election last month, and it was quite an interesting one because it was a really, really close-run thing. The Jamaican Labour Party, who actually formed the government, only have a one-seat majority, And the result of the election was really close. It got really confusing. It came down to recounts and ballot boxes being taken down out of the mountains. And for a while, there was utter confusion. In fact, the Electoral Commission of Jamaica had to hold a press conference just to explain what the hell was going on in the process. Now, in a position like that, in a situation like that, it becomes really, really important that the everyday people who are monitoring these processes are able to verify that things are done correctly. Because if there are any malpractices, if anything is going wrong, that could potentially have affected the entire outcome of the election. And as it happens, CAFE, this great organisation, verified at the end of the process that as far as they were concerned, things were conducted in a free and fair way. However, they did also release quite an extraordinary statement, which I'll read from this screen here. And what they said was, CAFE finds it necessary to declare its immense disappointment at the manner in which its observers have been treated by election officials during the course of the proceedings on election day. Firstly, CAFE's volunteers were prevented from entering the polling stations in many locations. In many cases where they were allowed entry, they were instructed they would only be allowed to remain for 3 minutes. A large number of volunteers were told they would not be allowed to stay to monitor the counting of the election ballots. Now that, in some ways, is even more scary, even more worrying than electoral irregularities, because that is power saying, we don't want this to happen in daylight. We want to haul things back into the shadows. We're not going to allow scrutiny. And in some ways, that's even more scary. And it's that sort of thing that we really have to keep an eye on, no matter where it's happening. There's many other examples of where ordinary people can get involved in holding power and authority to account. And you can probably think of some. But there's a couple of things that concern me, and 2 issues in particular. The first is that I mentioned earlier about being a member of an independent monitoring board. And independent monitoring boards exist for every prison, immigration removal centre, short-term holding facility in the UK. That's about 1,000 people who do this volunteering, and they routinely publish reports, routinely explain to the public what's going on. But until I mentioned them earlier, and I'd be interested to see, had anybody in here actually heard of independent monitoring boards or their work? Can't see any hands up anywhere. So we've got all this monitoring that goes on, holding power to account on behalf of the public, set up through the mechanisms of the state, and yet nobody has ever heard of their work. And I think that partly lies in some of the mechanisms for communication. So we heard just now about the infinite storytelling, and we know that's about some of the mechanisms that people can use to get their messages out there. But it seems as though even though there's these really good systems for monitoring what goes on, a lot of that is just not being communicated in the right way. The second point is that I think there's a lot more ways in which ordinary people could hold some of this, in particular, low-level power to account that we just haven't yet created systems for. And one thing that my organisation is particularly keen to do is to start trying to break down some of these cultural barriers, to try and create ways of getting people to think more about how we can get people to question the way that power or authority is used. If you think about the way that lots of budget cuts are taking place at the moment in health services and all over the place, there's a great deal of temptation perhaps for power to be misused or corners to be cut, and there's lots of areas where just ordinary members of the public could potentially raise concerns and actually bring concerns to the attention of the government or the wider public. And what would be really interesting would be if some of these big established forms of monitoring, like the independent monitoring boards, could help to take some of those skills and teach them to more ordinary people out there. And then if that's maybe combined with some of the citizens' journalism that we've seen, with some of the technology that's available, we might all become much better informed about how it is that authority is actually being exerted, and better prepared, better able, more confident in doing what we should all really be doing, which is holding mirrors to power. Thank you. I think